For our next conversation, please provide a warm welcome to USC's newly appointed Papazian Early Career Chair in Armenian Studies, Dr. Hrag Papazian, and Project Manager at the USC Institute of Armenian Studies, Manuk Avedikyan.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm Manuk Avedikyan. I work at the Institute of Armenian Studies here at USC. It's my pleasure to lead a conversation with Hrag Papazian, who's the new Papazian Early Career Chair in Contemporary Armenian Studies. He's also an assistant professor in the anthropology department. We're going to be speaking, as the panel and your programs say, about the Turkish factor, related to the Artsakh, related to Artsakh and its impact on society in particular. So Hrag, most of us in this room, when we associate Turkey, Armenia, Armenians, Turks, we usually think about the Armenian genocide, its post-genocidal reality, denialism. However, during the 2020 Artsakh war, Turkey's role in the region and its image is changed considerably. Turkish military cooperation with drones, as everyone has seen during the war, the F-16s, even Turkish military generals who one could argue were dictating Azerbaijani military strategy. And following the war, there were joint military parades. There was more coordinated Azerbaijani and Turkish diplomacy. And of course, in parallel, there was Armenian-Turkish normalization that's now been taking place, or what we think is taking place. Though your research primarily focuses on Armenians in Turkey, you've written considerably and published very recently about the societal reverberations of Turkey's participation in the 2020 Artsakh war. Can you discuss the impact of Turkey's participation and on its image in Armenian society as a neighboring country?
Sure, thanks, Manuk. So obviously the first impact that Turkey's participation had on Armenians was the impact on Armenians of Artsakh. That was the most direct one, as Turkey was very much instrumental in making Azerbaijan's victory possible, and that is spoken about quite often. But another impact is one that is less spoken about, is its impact beyond the borders, now non-existing borders of Artsakh, specifically on Armenian society in Armenia or beyond, though the research I did was within Yerevan, Armenia. And this impact is one that is cultural, societal, one that belongs rather to the field of systems of meanings, if you want. And I'm speaking here about the change of Turkey's image and the perceptions of Turkey amongst Armenians as a result of its participation in the war on the side of Azerbaijan. Its image shifted, I put it as follows, from one of distant or absent neighbor to a very present contemporary threat. So distant, absent neighbor and historical enemy to present contemporary threat. It's interesting to see that throughout the decades of Armenia's independence, despite Turkey being a neighboring country, it had this level of absence from Armenians' both geographic and geopolitical imagination. This has to do with several factors, one being the fact that Turkey and Armenia never established diplomatic relations. Second, the fact that the border, the very long border, was always sealed, and Turkey was always not letting it open, basically. And so geographers, human geographers, anthropologists of space have often studied and well established the importance of the possibility to travel across land, across the border, for a conception of region and regioning capacities to take place. And at the absence of such possibility, and in particular, seeing that the only way of traveling to Turkey is, going through Georgia or taking a plane at some periods of time that was possible. That only makes Turkey somehow seem, again, distant and as if not belonging to the region. But that's on the very, geographical imagination level. When we approach the geopolitical level, it's even more important, because Armenians usually thought that, again, Turkey does not belong to the region also geopolitically, does not have a real say in the region and would not have a real impact on the region, which was seen as Russia's backyard, right? And so there was this perception or expectation that Russia would not let Turkey cross the river Araks, right? Both, militarily, but also geopolitically speaking. And in that regard, the fact that Turkey returned to the region through its support of Azerbaijan, it made it also return to Armenians' regional understanding, regional imagination, and it somehow reshaped its own image within Armenian society. And so Armenians immediately started somehow realizing that the historical enemy that we've always thought of through our, familial stories of generational collective memories of the genocide, it's now more than just a historical enemy. It's a contemporary, very present neighbor and a real immediate threat that can cross the border if it wants and can send its Bayraktars and military personnel to basically have a real say in the region, but also quite violent impact and aggressive impact on our lives and our soldiers' lives.
You spoke about the image of Turkey as a state entity with its imagination. Can you discuss the impact of the image of the Turk within Armenian society?
Sure. In fact, it's obvious that when Turkey is coming, the Turk is also coming, right? Again, from the perception, I'm speaking about the popular perception here primarily. And before perhaps dwelling further on this, I should say that the understanding of the Turk, the meaning of the very ethnonym Turk is, in Armenia, is different than what it is generally elsewhere. In Armenia, the term Turk has a much more complex semantic reality, if you want, a much more complicated symbolic understanding, as it has several other meanings or ways of being interpreted and applied, right? So I'll speak about two of these and then say how the war came to impact these in turn. One is its equation or its connection with Azerbaijanis. That is, this has surprised me initially, me coming from diaspora. I grew up in Beirut, and in Beirut, we always use the term Azeri, never Turk. But in Armenia, the word Turk is used equally for, and even more, because they are more present, they've been more present at least until this last war, for Azerbaijanis, as it is for Turks from the Republic of Turkey. So that equation is there. It has its own, historical development and evolution. But at least since Soviet times, those who used to live within the Soviet Armenian Republic, and then the ones who would then go to Azerbaijan and become Azerbaijani citizens, so these Muslim, Turkic-speaking Soviet citizens, if you want, were always spoken of as Turks, were always called Turk. So that's one equation, one layer, one semantic, if you want, dyad or equation. The other one is has its roots in the history of and the memory of the genocide, of course. And that's where, at times, the term, the ethnonym Turk, though it's an ethnonym, but it goes as far as almost getting abstracted from its ethnic meaning and being generalized and to be used as a synonym of simply, without any ethnic connotation, simply as a synonym of a threat, an injurer, the one who harms, specifically the one who can harm the Armenian. And it's very interesting that speaking with some of my interlocutors, from at least some of them, have heard the word Turk in this meaning before even hearing it in the sense, in its ethnic sense, right? And then they would, only then they would learn that that's a word that is used to describe an ethnic people that has had a very violent history with us, the history of the genocide, the memory. One example I could cite was someone telling me that first time I remember hearing that word was from my mother when I and my brother used to quarrel and fight and hit each other. She would come and tell us, "You're not Turks, are you? You're hitting each other." So that's the other level. Another example I can bring is I saw before the war during an environmental protest that had nothing, absolutely nothing to do with neither Turks of Turkey nor Turks of Azerbaijan. And then there were the policemen, Armenian villagers had blocked the way towards a potential mining site. And Armenian policemen started attacking them. And the villagers started shouting at them, "Turks, Turks, again, you're not a Turk," right? And so the war and Turkey's participation, or the Turks' participation in the war on the side of Azerbaijan, had an impact slightly different from the case of its impact on the image of Turkey. Whereas in the case of Turkey, as I said, the image was reshaped. In this case, it wasn't reshaped, it wasn't reconfigured. On the contrary, it was consolidated in both of these directions. So both of these meanings of the Turk and of the Turk were consolidated and strengthened further because of the participation of the war. That is, and I think that's quite obvious. If the Azerbaijanis and the Turks and Turkey are warring together against us Armenians in Artsakh and in Armenia, and specifically using they themselves the motto "İki devlet bir millet," right? 2 states, 1 nation, then yes, the Azerbaijanis are Turks, right? But also, since they're attacking, since they're doing this aggression, they're harming the Armenian again, then yes, the meaning of the Turk as the harmer, the injurer, gets refilled. And I'll end by just mentioning how these two conceptual dyads also inform and contribute to each other. Suffice it for any Armenian to subscribe to any of these two, and then the other would automatically get either produced or reproduced in their imagination. Let's take the example of the beheadings of Armenian POWs or even civilians during the 2020 war and attack on Artsakh. Suffice it again, if an Armenian watching those graphic scenes on Telegram subscribes to the Turk injurer, right, equation, seeing that act of aggression against the Armenian, he would be or she would be inclined to call that person a Turk. And then that person doing it in Azerbaijani, then the Azerbaijani is in fact a Turk. Then they're not wrong saying that Azerbaijanis are the same as the Turks. And then after you do that, and after you see him as a Turk, then you are also, again, on the popular level, I'm generalizing, but you are inclined, one is inclined to extrapolate that act of aggression against an Armenian, not just to all Azerbaijanis, but also to all Turks everywhere, including in Turkey. Hence, the image of the Turk as the aggressor and as the harmer and injurer of the Armenian gets replenished again.
I'd like to change the topic to go across the border towards Turkey. I think many of us in the room understand, see ourselves maybe also in some of these dyads that you were talking about earlier. But going across the border, we know at the same time that the Turkish social and political imagination towards Armenia and Armenians has also changed and been impacted. Despite Turkey going through a period of democratization and openness towards minorities, one could argue at least until 2015, there's been a real serious backsliding towards authoritarianism since then. There's been a real expansion of nationalism. We see in the most recent parliamentary elections, the nationalist parties had even larger shares of the vote. There's been increased racist and hateful rhetoric towards almost every minority, Armenians not being any exception. Armenian genocide denial has taken uglier, more aggressive forms, and even Armenia and Artsakh has entered the Turkish citizens' imagination. What I want to say about that is I've been visiting friends and family in Turkey for the past 15 years, on and off, and I'm pretty open about my Armenian identity with the average person in Turkey. But I've noticed a major change. In a recent visit after the 2020 Artsakh war, in a normal conversation, you would eventually, for the first time, hear things related to Artsakh, Qarabakh. You would hear rhetoric about Khojali or occupation, and this type of rhetoric would never come up before the 2020 war. Your primary research is on the Armenians living in Turkey, the Christian community, along with the new migrants from Armenia, along with Muslim Armenians. These communities have usually lived with genocide denial, but it seems there's something new. The issue of Qarabakh is a new thing on the plate of these groups. What have you observed of the impact of the recent war and last year's ethnic cleansing on the Armenian communities living in Turkey?
Well, yes. First, it's very interesting to see as a mirror, how, again, the war and Turkey's participation also reshaped perhaps the image or refilled the Turkish nationalist rhetoric as well about the Armenian and against the Armenian. But the thing is that whereas you do not have actual Turks living in Armenia, so some people are eager to find some in the political arena. We do have still Armenians living in the Republic of Turkey, in post-genocide Turkey, these being both those who survived and became citizens of the Republic of Turkey, minoritized, but also a new wave of migration, labor migration primarily, beginning in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union from the Republic of Armenia to Istanbul. And these people found themselves during the war in an extremely hostile environment, and the war thus had also a different yet also a first-hand impact on them. Just like it had, not just like it had, but it had a first-hand impact, of course, on the Armenians in Artsakh, Qarabakh, but also it had another kind of a first-hand impact on Armenians living in Istanbul, who were living in reality within the borders of one side of the war. Just because Turkey portrayed itself and acted as a clear side in the war, that led to an immense rise in anti-Armenian rhetoric, anti-Armenian hate speech, be that in media or on social media by politicians or just the general population, and as you mentioned, some examples that could also take place in a taxi cab. And imagine you being an Armenian of Istanbul, hearing that hate speech against the Armenian, the Ermeni, and seeing Turkey warring against Armenia. So Armenians of Turkey have always been in this very precarious situation and position of being somehow being in Turkey yet being Armenians. And every time there has been conflict or rising tensions between Armenia and Turkey, or between Turkey and the Armenian diaspora, they suffered. They went through difficult times. In this case, it was not just hate speech, but also even attempts of even physical intimidation. We had at least 2 nationalist convoys of cars with Turkish and Azerbaijani flags and nationalist rhetorics and slogans driving intentionally towards Armenian populated neighborhoods. One drove literally next to the Armenian Patriarchate in Kumkapı, another in Kurtuluş, which is known to be a quite Armenian populated, dominant Armenian population neighborhood. But it also had a quite hard impact on the migrants from the Republic of Armenia, these being specifically citizens of Armenia, these being, many of them being undocumented migrants, right? And then being in Istanbul. So again, many of them felt threatened, even more threatened, because their presence there is always and already questioned, right? And perhaps I'll end by citing to one informant from the field, from there, who made a comparison between his experience in 2016 during the 4-day war on Artsakh and in 2020. In 2016, he said, the media was, of course, covering it, but it was covering it as a conflict between 2 other parties. In 2020, it was different. The whole discourse was as if we are fighting against Armenia, we are fighting Armenians, and we're gonna crush them this time. And that obviously could not have an impact on them. And so many of them felt threatened. Many of them even left Turkey at the time, some temporarily, some for good.
Thank you for that insight. It's a large thing. It's a large issue to overcome. I mean, I appreciate that most recent, example that you gave. I wanted to end this conversation with saying that now that you're in Los Angeles and you're also teaching at USC, I hope that we could follow your work and your publications on this topic and on the topics related to Armenians in Turkey and all topics in relation. Thank you, Hrag.
Thank you, Manuk.
Thank you.